I want to say a word of congratulations to Janet Miller, who retired yesterday. That's right. Congratulations, Janet. Moving on to the next chapter in her life, and hopefully will be one that looms large amongst us. We're glad to have her here. A lot to talk about this week. Since I'm sandwiching this in between two funerals that are significant to me, what I really wanted to talk about this week was the 4th of July. I told Pastor June when she set the preaching schedule up, I said I always preach on the 4th of July. It's tradition. That's what I like to do. I'm a historian. I want to preach on the 4th of July. But she had me preaching for this Sunday, and of course this is the Sunday of our annual meeting. I thought, well, maybe, who knows, there might be some crisis or something that requires my intervention. So I'll go ahead and schedule myself. And then I realized the 4th of July is between the two Sundays, and we have this wonderful text from Galatians. For freedom, Christ has set us free. You think God doesn't have a good lesson plan sometimes, better than mine? And so I just could not avoid that, because that is a wonderful text. I want to talk first of all about this man, Nelson Mandela. In 1990, in fact in February, he was released from prison after having spent 27 years. He was 72 years old at the time. His crime had been advocating and fighting for the freedom of his people against the system of apartheid in South Africa. They had labeled him a terrorist. They had thrown him in jail, and that imprisonment for 27 years was pretty brutal. He was beaten. He was not allowed a lot of food or water. He had to break rocks every day. He was only allowed to have one letter in and one letter out a year for the first 20 years or so of that imprisonment. Now, eventually they allowed him to read and to write and to speak with other prisoners, and while he was in the prison, his thinking about freedom changed inexorably. When he came out, he wrote a book, Long Walk to Freedom. I want to read you some excerpts from that. He said, "During those long, lonely years, my hunger for the freedom of my own people became a hunger for the freedom of all people. I knew, as well as I know anything, that the oppressor must be liberated as surely as the oppressed, because a man who takes someone else's freedom away is a prisoner of hatred, locked behind bars of prejudice and narrow-mindedness. I will never be free when I'm taking away the freedom of someone else." When Mandela was released and apartheid was finally abolished, the world held its breath. He was then elected president on the African, I think it's the African Union ticket. Then the world really held its breath. They expected a bloodbath, because that was pretty typical of African democracies in those days. But instead, when Mandela was elected president, what the world witnessed was an extraordinary example of freedom. South Africa was transformed under the leadership of Nelson Mandela to a truly free society. Now, they're not without problems, needless to say, not without problems by a long shot. But the bloodbath never occurred. And later on, after he resigned his presidency, he was having an interview with Larry King, and Larry King asked him how, after 27 years of being imprisoned by the most brutal regime, and one of the most brutal regimes in history, he hadn't come to hate his captors and desire revenge. Instead, he answered this way. He said, "They kept me in prison for 27 years, and if that would have caused me to hate, then I would have been in prison for the rest of my life." Nelson Mandela refused to hate. He made a choice not to hate, but to reconcile. He understood both that God has given them. We were made to be free, you know. We're even free to go to hell if that's what we choose. Later on, when the children of Israel were as slaves in Egypt, God heard their cries and sent a liberator, Moses, who led them out of slavery into freedom. Throughout the Bible, in fact, you can say God is an agitator for freedom, urging and helping people to be free of anything that enslaves them or prevents them from becoming the thing that God had created them to be. St. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 3:17, "Wherever the Spirit of the Lord can be found, there you will find freedom." That didn't come out of Philadelphia in 1776, you know. But the Bible is also very realistic about how fragile freedom is, about its risks and its obligations. Not long after the children of Israel escape from slavery, they're out in the desert. No food, no water, unsure about where the next day is going to lead them. And that's something they deal with, a reality to live with for 40 years. But in that first moment, just a couple of miles away from slavery, just a few hours into their freedom, what do? They look back and they say out loud, you know, slavery wasn't such a bad gig. They had a roof over our head, there was lots to eat, leeks and garlic, they said. You see, slavery was preferred to them because freedom was very frightening. They gave up their security, and they were willing to give up the freedom because they were afraid. In their freedom, the first thing they missed was their slavery, their captivity. It's a sobering historical reminder that we are not different. Fear causes people to give up the freedom that they have in the name of security. The German people elected this guy freely by a majority vote, and the Nazi Party because they were afraid. A hysterical fear of communism led this country back in the 1950s to follow this man, Joseph McCarthy, who advocated for a restriction of the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. You know where those freedoms come from? The First Amendment of the Constitution. Basic American freedoms. And here's where we live today, where we are afraid. So afraid that we're building a wall along our border and restricting access to this country, and people are driven to acts of desperation as a result, with tragic results. We all are trying to keep the other out. You might wonder what the founders of this country might think about such oppressiveness, but you don't have to wonder. They wrote it all down. It's called the Declaration of Independence. Let me read to you a snippet of it. We have appealed to their native justice and to their generosity. They have been deaf to the voice of justice. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them and the rest of mankind to accounts. Enemies in war, friends in peace. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish that these united colonies are and of a right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be dissolved. We don't read that part very often. You see, those founders, they knew how rare and precious and fragile freedom was. We're remembering them this week, you know. Tomorrow, July the 1st, they took the very first vote on that resolution that I just read to you. John Adams got up to speak, and historian David McCullough recounts that he spoke logically and clearly and carefully. He looked into the future. He saw a new nation, a new time. When a couple of delegates from New Jersey came in late, about an hour late, they asked him if he would start over, and he did. Nobody's ever come in late to my sermon and asked me to start over from the beginning. They took a preliminary vote after a 9-hour debate on that day, and 9 of the colonies voted yes. But they had decided up front it had to be a unanimous vote. Ben Franklin's the one who said, if we don't hang together, we shall most certainly hang separately. So the delegates adjourned for the night. They debated at City Tavern late into the evening, and there, while they were debating still, word came that 100 British battleships had just landed in New York Harbor and offloaded about 10,000 British troops. They got back up the next morning at 9 o'clock, July the 2nd, and at 10, they took a second vote. All 13 colonies voted yea, and they had declared independence. These are the words that Adams wrote to his wife Abigail in a letter that came out right after that day. He wrote, "Objects of the most stupendous magnitude now lay before us. We are in the midst of a revolution, the most complete, unexpected, and remarkable of any in the history of the world. The 2nd day of July of 1776 will be the most memorable day in the history of America. They will celebrate it by succeeding generations from this time forward and forevermore." Well, almost. He was almost right. Because, you see, they continued to discuss and debate this document for 2 more days before they sent Thomas Jefferson off to write everything they had talked about down. And that's the document you see before us. This is how he began the document. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Endowed by the Creator, Jefferson wrote. God is the author of freedom, the author of liberty. And so they voted for a final time on the 4th of July, and then they all lined up to sign it. And lest you think they were opportunists or politicians or faddists, the final words of that declaration sums up their intent. For the support of this declaration, they wrote, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Which, by the way, meant something to them back in those days. Now, these men were believers. Mostly they were deists who believed in nature's God. Some were conventional Christians. John Jay was a devout Episcopalian. Sam Adams was a Puritan. John Adams loved the Episcopal liturgy, but was himself a Unitarian. John Witherspoon from New Jersey was a Presbyterian minister, the only one in Congress. Thomas Paine, whom you've heard about, was an agnostic. And Benjamin Franklin, well, God, nobody knows what he was. The Catholics thought he was a Catholic, and the Anglicans thought he was an Anglican. The Presbyterians thought he was a Presbyterian. The Friends, that's what he really was, the Quakers, considered him a wet Quaker, that is, somebody who drank. But one thing's for sure, they all understood that political freedom rested upon the foundation of religious freedom, and religious freedom rested upon the freedom of a bound conscience. And if you've heard that phrase before, you're right. Because that's what Luther said on the day he stood before the Diet of Worms and said, "Here I stand. My conscience is bound." When Thomas Jefferson died, he had 3 things written on his tombstone. This is his actual tombstone. Only 3 things he wanted to be remembered for. Number 1, the author of the Declaration of Independence. Number 2, the founder of the University of Virginia. And number 3, the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. We were not a Christian nation at our inception, but we were always a free one, rooted in liberty and individual conscience. And even though these men were at the very best religiously tepid, they were all of them keenly aware that they had invented something absolutely new, something absolutely precious, and our finest hours as a nation, the Revolutionary War, the abolition of slavery, the expansion of human rights, especially the rights of freed slaves and women, and the fight against Jim Crow, all stem from our understanding of where freedom originates. And the words that are inscribed upon the Statue of Liberty, those wonderful words written by an immigrant named Emma Lazarus, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my torch beside a golden door." All of those can be traced back to the religious ideals of liberty and justice and love that came from our scripture and informed the thinking of these men. For freedom, Christ has set us free, St. Paul writes today in a letter written to the church in Galatia after a church fight. Remember, I told you last week they had a fight over the relationship of the law and Christian freedom, and Paul was a Jew and Jesus was a Jew, and those first Christians were Jews, and Jesus taught he had come to fulfill the law, not to abolish it. And Paul had seen something different. The law had regulated Jewish life from what to eat and what to wear and when to work and when to rest and how to cook and how to raise your kids and how to farm. It had given order and cohesion to the Jewish people for 20 centuries of exile and persecution. But when the Gentiles joined the church, they looked like a pretty shabby bunch to the Jews. They ate what they pleased, they didn't keep kosher, they didn't observe the Sabbath, and they were particularly unhappy about the whole notion of circumcision. So a delegation from Jerusalem went to Galatia to tell them that it was their opinion they couldn't be real Christians until they obeyed the law, until they placed themselves under the Mosaic law. And that confrontation forced Paul to think through one of the most important tenets of religious freedom, that we are saved by faith through grace, not by works of the law. We're loved by God, and there's not a thing we can do to earn it. Grace has set us free to fulfill the true intent of the law, which, as Paul writes, is to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. For freedom, Christ has set you free. Never submit again to a yoke of slavery, Paul wrote. Never. And that's a word we need to hear today. Never submit yourselves to a yoke of slavery. This is not the freedom to do whatever you please. It's the freedom to obey the clear obligation to love God and to love your neighbor. That's what the law is for. But we don't live in that world right now. Today runs contrary to how we live our lives as Americans. It runs contrary to the politics of division and entitlement that marks much of our thinking today. Those brave souls who signed the Declaration weren't proposing freedom to do whatever we pleased. They weren't proposing the freedom to do whatever we voted on. Perhaps more than anyone in history, they understood that freedom, that liberty, meant more than the freedom from coercion. It meant the obligation to serve the common good. They knew in the future we would continue to argue and fight and struggle and sometimes die to defend that ideal. But it would be worth the fight. They knew what the obligations of freedom are. Do you? In this week of celebration, let us not forget what we've been offered to this world. It's not our culture. It's our values. Our culture is coarse and unrefined and faddish, but our values are eternal and worth talking about and worth fighting over and worth defending and worth dying for. And some of you people in this room put on the uniform to do precisely that. Let us not forget our most precious value is freedom. And finally, let us not forget that the most effective way to show this world what this value is like is to live it out every day. And especially let us remember, as followers of Jesus Christ, that in his gracious love, we have been freed from all that might diminish us or oppress us. We've been freed from fear, free to live, free to laugh, free to do all that, to avoid all that might diminish or oppress us, even free to give our lives away in service to others. When we remember the gift and the obligation, then we can rightly sing the words of what is, I think, one of the best religious, political, or patriotic songs there are. My country, 'tis of thee. But this verse that goes like this: Our fathers, God, to thee, author of liberty, to thee we sing. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy might, great God, our King. Have a great 4th of July. Don't eat too many hamburgers. Don't forget the values that our Lord lived and died for, and that a lot of people that we know and loved died for as well. For freedom, Christ has set you free. To God be the glory. Amen.